Now, we've all heard by now about the attempted shooting at the Christian Conservative Research Council, the shooting that did take place. There were no casualties, just one person was injured. Now, a 28-year-old man, Floyd Lee Corkins II, entered the premises shooting a security guard. He didn't die, but apparently the guy took the bullet well enough to be able to tackle his attacker and get the gun away from him, which that in itself is pretty impressive. Now, the man is being held by the police, and he is currently undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. One has been ordered, obviously. And now officials have recovered a loaded Sig Sauer 9mm pistol and 2 additional loaded 9mm magazines. Now, about this, I would just like to say that's a nice choice. A Sig Sauer is actually pretty awesome. Now, these are some of the criminal charges that he's actually facing. Assault with intent to kill, interstate transportation of a firearm and ammunition, and these could give him a possible 40 years in prison. Now, he did conduct all this with a backpack, and once the backpack was searched, police found 50 rounds of 9mm ammunition and 15 Chick-fil-A sandwiches. I can't possibly think of any reason why he would need 15 sandwiches. Maybe for some people shooting guns makes them hungry or takes up a lot of energy, or maybe he was trying to make some kind of a statement. Maybe he was planning to shoot the place up and then throw the sandwiches everywhere as a kind of political statement, which would be kind of lols, but mostly stupid. Now, the Family Research Council President Tony Perkins said that the Chick-fil-A company did give the Family Research Council about $1,000 several years ago. So it seems likely that if this individual was actually aware that this transaction, this gifting had taken place, then maybe by that he was trying to make a statement by it. Now, witnesses, according to the FBI, witnesses claim that Corkins, upon entering the place, said a statement along the lines of that he didn't like their politics or didn't like their policies, and then began to open fire, which would seem like a reasonable thing to say before opening fire on a political institution. And it would just make sense. Now, the FBI says that he was reportedly a volunteer at an organization in Washington for the LGBT community. And knowing the Family Council's stance on homosexuality, which is horribly evil and backwards, it seems like this would be a very likely motivation for the guy to actually carry out this attack. However, it's been noted that he has no significant criminal record, meaning there's nothing, usually what that means when police says is there's nothing violent, or to a lesser degree, nothing connected to what he was currently being arrested for. Like, you could be involved in murder and you've got like traffic tickets, or you've got something really small that doesn't really matter. Now, very interestingly, this hasn't become the big, story that a lot of other stories have, shooting stories turn out to be. This is the thing that a lot of conservatives are pointing to. Oh, well, a lib shoots something and like, oh, the media's ignoring it like it's nothing. And it's going to be in the news for a couple days and it's going to disappear. However, the Batman shooting in Aurora, Colorado is going to go on forever. Now, on the surface, that does appear to be true. I mean, I do think this story is going to die down and disappear very quickly. However, I would also like to compare that to the shooting of the Pentagon several years ago. As some people will, I believe it was the Pentagon. Somebody had approached, he was conservative, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, came in and he opened fire on people that were entering the Pentagon, including several politicians. Nobody died, but even that in itself was actually very, very small. It was only in the news for a couple of days, and then it just completely disappeared. And he was, I believe the person had said they were a libertarian, or they were something along anti-big government, some kind of ideology. I don't remember offhand. Hopefully there will be a link in the description, because I will have found it by the time I upload this video. Now, while I am not condoning the shooting, because that in itself could be interpreted as a criminal act, it seems kind of logical that with a lot of these violent shootings being taken place by conservatives, whether they be mentally fit or mentally incompetent, like the Nazi shooting of the Sikh temple or the Aurora, Colorado shooting, or any number of the abortion doctors that have been murdered by the U.S. right wing, it would seem logical that since all this hatred is dumped on the LGBT community over, I would suppose since the beginning, I would say about the beginning of private property, because before, I'm not claiming private property caused this, although some asshole in the description is going to say that. I think it's about this time that such homophobic behaviors and gender rollings really started to form. With all the hatred that's been thrown at them, you would kind of have to imagine that since all these countless acts of violence that are carried out against LGBT people have been going on for all this time, that sooner or later something to this effect would happen. That there would be some kind of violence that was thrown back at the people who tend to hold the belief that these kinds of violent acts and general hatred thrown at LGBT community is correct. I mean, it would be illogical to assume that at some point there would, it would be illogical to assume that there would never be any kind of retaliation for something like that. I'm not saying that's what motivated this guy. I'm not saying he's getting revenge for all the LGBT people that have been harmed for thousands of years. I'm saying with a society that is so hell-bent on revenge for even like the slightest things, that all the hatred and vitriol and, well, repression that's been thrown at the LGBT community, you have to imagine somebody sooner or later is going to do something like this. And it shouldn't be really all that unexpected when you really consider the context of the United States. When civil rights was the big issue in the 50s, 60s, somewhat in the 70s, acts of violence were common. The government was horribly repressive to black people who stood for their rights in any way. Don't forget the times that the Black Panthers organized community groups, armed groups, to protect black citizens from police violence. It's not all that unimaginable that a similar thing would happen with the LGBT rights that are now radically being challenged for the first time in possibly the entire U.S. history. I mean, this is a very radical time for the LGBT community. So we should expect on some level something like this to happen. I'm not trying to say that a shooting by some guy who may or may not be crazy is the same thing as a mass resistance against police repression in the 60s. I'm saying the same kinds of social conditions. Now obviously they're not to the same extent. They're not as acute as they were back in the 60s. But in the LGBT community is obviously also much, much smaller than African Americans are in the United States, a much smaller portion of the population. But you can imagine that such kind of social repression would eventually have perhaps a similar backlash that's coming for it. So I would not be surprised if there was some more violence in the near future, or possibly the far future, depending on how long it takes the United States to accept that LGBT people are the same as everybody else, that there could be a lot of violence in the future as a result. I wouldn't expect anything anywhere near the way the civil rights movement was, but there very possibly will be instances like this happening in the future, because when you have a section of the population that is repressed so horribly, you have to expect some kind of backlash. It's only going to get worse. And this kind of resistance would very likely to go well for the LGBT community, as they will begin to be taken more seriously as a social force that will demand the same rights as everyone else. Because, as Mao once said, there is a great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent.